Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. We honor creators. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We have two authors, John Hansen and Randy Watts, on the show. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. And welcome, John.
Thanks, Randy.
And we're going to be talking about, let's say, John, you said it better. Talk about what the show is going to be a little bit so that I don't have to rely on my old mind.
Okay, misplaced trust. So one of the flaws I have been able to recognize now in my post-Mormon life is that most of us placed trust in certain people because of their positions or because of their ways of just being uber Mormon, and so we put that trust in them, and of course it wasn't their fault or our fault, but we were led astray. We were led into a lifestyle and a life that maybe we didn't bargain on, and so on March 30th of this year, just recently, just 2 weeks ago, there was a man by the name of Scott Dale Owen, who was a really close friend of mine on my mission to Guatemala back in 78 and 79 and 80. So I was kind of half years through it. And he was just the greatest leader ever. He was my first zone leader when I got there. And he used to come and save my sanity when I was out at a little remote village in nowhere's land. And I trusted him because he walked the walk and talked the talk. And I just completely trusted him. But he was just sentenced on March 30th to 15 years to life in prison. So he was in Provo practicing as a psychiatrist who was a specialist or counselor, I should say. He was a counselor in counseling. He specialized in counseling men who had homosexual tendencies in the church into whatever, throwing that away, but and living the good life, as they would say. And so he had his good friend and the person who was the main owner of this counseling company in Provo. That was his good friend who was his stake president. And so he was not only my first zone leader and my AP on my mission, but he was also a bishop a few times, stake president. And so I didn't, what he was convicted of was doing his counseling with people he was trying to counsel into being heterosexual. I guess he would claim that there was a technique he used. So I'm saying he would claim this to his patients. He would say, there's a technique I use that's different. And so he would then touch them. He would then, approach them and basically abuse them. And so the history of that was so bizarre to me because I knew him so well on my mission. And I have had to ask myself a million times, why did I trust him so much? Why did I like him so much? Why, when my own companion, when we did splits, and my companion went with him, with Scott Owen, and I went with the companion Scott Owen came and hung out with me for that weekend or whatever, it was. And so then when he would come back, my companion would come back, he would be all upset. And he would say,
like, I really don't like that guy or something like that.
Yeah, it started out that way. And then it became just blatant accusations about him being gay, about him being making advances on him, those kinds of things.
Can I just interject and make a couple of translations for the folks who have not been LDS? When John talks about this missionary being an AP, that's an assistant to the mission president, which is a pretty highly esteemed position on a mission.
It's like the highest calling you can have as a missionary.
Absolutely. And then if a companionship in a mission trades companions for the day or for a few days, they call it splits, and you end up working with someone that you're not, that you don't typically work with. I just wanted to interject that for the.
That's right, and that's mostly for training purposes, or I don't know. Is it sometimes just to have a little bit of variety in your life? Yeah, because there's so much monotonous things that happen. So much stuff is a routine that it's kind of good to split up the routine a little bit.
Right. So it sounds like from the get-go, he was a leader.
So there were signs, John. You're saying there are signs that you can tell something is off a little bit with somebody, even though they're charismatic.
Right. And so, yeah. So in this book that I had written called "Navigating on Black Ice: My Mormon Life."
Love the cover.
And when did that book come out?
It's kind of like a Utah or Idaho road out in the country, highway out in the country, huh?
Your book came out about a year ago?
Yeah, about a year ago.
Yeah. And so you wrote some things in your book, not even thinking that we would ever do this show.
Right. Yeah. So one of the chapters, and specifically, this is chapter 13, is a chapter called Blind Obedience. And may I just read a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. Social norms and predictable behaviors have been the strength of any organization that wants to keep its members in check. The Mormon Church was no different. To question its leaders, its doctrines, or its tradition is considered heresy. A favorite movie of mine is Taken, with Liam Neeson as the star. As I watched him overcome insurmountable odds to recover his kidnapped daughter, I realized that in every encounter, he gets the jump on the enemy by breaking from normal expected behavior.
He has special skills. That's what I remember him saying.
Yeah, it's fiction, and yet the principle holds true, right? So the story was fiction, but the principle holds true that we have certain expectations, and we have these things set in our minds. So when I first met Scott Owen, Dr. Scott Owen, well, he's not a doctor anymore. He had his license revoked back in, I think it was 2018. As a kind of,
but he still might have like a PhD, right? That you can't take that away from people.
Can't take that away. Yeah. But anyway, he couldn't practice since 2018 because they had taken his license away in a negotiation after the first few complaints had come in about him. So the complaints were many against him by I guess it was the state or the county. I'm not sure who initiated this, but he had accusations from just so many of his former patients, and they just chose 3. They just chose the 3 where they had the strongest evidence, where they knew that he would be nailed, and which was probably smart by the prosecution to focus on the important ones and leave everything else. And so based on those 3, yes, he was found guilty. I think it was in December or January of this year. And then in March 30th, the judge sentenced him to 15 years to life, which is basically a life sentence because he's my age, he's 66. And so he, it puts him at 80, 81 or whatever, which is when my dad died. So I assume that's a life sentence, based on that. So I've had to ask myself, why did I believe when I had so much evidence telling me who he was? And it's this principle of breaking from expected behavior, and I think that part of his issue there was that he knew that there was an expected behavior and he had it down. He had the talk, he had the facial expressions. I was just thinking this morning about seeing him, giving talks and bearing testimony to the missionaries in the mission field and everything. And I thought, I don't really remember him ever saying, I know, or anything like that. But he would just say things like, he'd lean forward on the podium and say, elders and sisters, the church is true.
Right. Declarative statements instead of
Yeah.
affirmative.
Right.
Were there any indications on your mission that something untoward was going on? Did someone ever perceive that? Because you just kind of touched on maybe during splits, someone came home uncomfortable. Was there an indication that he was abusive at that point?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was obvious. It was all very subtle, because he was staying with the norms in terms of appearance, presentation, things like that. But we did these as I was saying, we did these missionary splits, because him and his companion were the zone leaders, and they were the best of friends, and they were the ones at the mission home that would just be smiling and laughing and joking, and missionaries would gather around them because they were just so much fun.
So did your companion sort of accuse him of being gay? Like, I think he's gay because he touched me weird or something like that.
Yeah. So they would come back from splits, and he would say that to me, and he'd say it in front of Dr. Owen. He would say that. Now, Dr. Owen, he would say that.
What exactly would he say?
He would say, I don't ever want to go back there again. I said, what are you talking about? And I would look over at Owen, and he would just be laughing, smiling and laughing. And he'd say, well, he's gay, he's gay. And he can try to act like he's not, but he is.
Just kind of a joking.
Yeah.
He was kind of joking in front of him?
No, he would say it serious.
But would Elder Owen say, oh, I was just teasing or something?
He would laugh and joke and say, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, he said.
Yeah. And so they would go through that little routine. And of course I would believe Owen, because he was the guy that helped me keep my sanity at the beginning of my mission. He was my zone leader, and he spoke he talked the talk, and he walked the walk, and he did everything like I would expect of someone who's a zone leader. And he went from being a zone leader to being the assistant to the president, and I trusted him then, and he helped me, many times throughout my mission. So I just thought the world of him. And for my companion, who I liked okay, but of course, with companions, we sometimes feel resentful of things, that they do, not washing their dishes or whatever, type things. And so
you could see your companion's faults more.
Yes.
So you just assumed that he was more faulty than this Elder Owen.
Right. And as the mission would go on, I would start to hear complaints, and his own companion, Owen's own companion, who used to come and stay with me on splits, and we would walk out to the beach or whatever and talk and stuff, and never talked about any of this stuff. But something happened, and all of a sudden the companion of Elder Owen demanded a split, or demanded demanded a transfer. And then he and I asked him what was going on, and he said, I just don't want anything to do with that guy ever again. And
Wow.
and I said, well, what happened? I don't understand. He says, I'm not going to talk about it. I just want out. and so yeah. So they got the transfer, and of course Owen just went in as the AP from there, as the assistant to the president from there.
So much for discernment by the mission president, huh?
Exactly, which is another great lesson. It's probably one of the things that hit me the hardest in my faith struggle, with the church was the recognition that there is no inspiration, there is no power of discernment, there is no power of the priesthood. They're just made up stuff. But we want to believe it. We want to believe it, so we leave space in there for it, right? And so Scott Owen, Scott Dale Owen is his full name. If anyone wants to look up that article, and that was again on March 30th that the sentencing took place, and so he just was charming, and for him to be a bishop a few times over and a counselor in the stake presidency and those things in Provo, where it's just like the heart of Mormonism, and he was just a natural. He was just so charming and a leader, and I trusted my own senses. Sorry, I trusted my own senses and believed that he was a great guy that could do no wrong. So, in my book, I also wrote a chapter called chapter 16 is called "Believe Our Own Thoughts?" ? Believe our own thoughts. Byron Katie, one of my favorite authors, that's a lady named Byron Katie, wrote, "When we believe what we think, we have to live out those thoughts."
That's
And
makes a lot of sense right there.
yeah, and so that statement has had a profound effect on my understanding of how I bought into the Mormon Church, why I stayed in, and why I got out of it, and why I believed in Scott Owen on our mission, and didn't realize that he had these issues. Now, throughout the mission, after these incidences I talked about throughout the mission, there were other things that happened where his either a companion of his or just another missionary who was from somewhere in Central America. There were, I can remember, 2 or 3 complaints to the mission home, and they were dumbfounded. They didn't know how to deal with it because they were so trusting of Elder Owen, and he was just so believable and credible. And why would they believe just a crazy accusation, by one of the Central Americans there?
So I feel like we have to go back to when you say the book about believing your thoughts, you're actually saying that you should take your thoughts and your belief with caution. You should sort of try to use more information and almost not believe your thoughts.
Yes, because in our arrogance as human beings, we have a tendency to, when we think a thought, we just believe it.
Right.
I created it. Must be true, right? And so there's a process we can go through to evaluate our thoughts.
And that's what happens with indoctrination. Your thoughts are put into your brain about something being true or factual, and since you start to think that, then that becomes reality in a way.
Right.
So like so that's why children believe in mostly the same religion that their parents believe. It's not because they independently came across information and decided that whatever their parents' belief system is what they should do. It's because their thoughts have been inundated with that information, and they just take the conclusions that their parents had. So like if they're Baptist, then the Baptist church is true. If they're Mormons, the Mormon church is true. If they're Hindu, the Hindu belief system is true, right? Or it represents how we should view the world, we'll say as well.
Right.
And so,
Because in school we have no classes on thought management. And really one of the important things we should be learning early on is thought management.
and that's,
And
you think, so we have a little bit like critical analysis, like we're taught to think critically, which means like, or rationally, right? To observe the facts and come to conclusions that are based on facts, right? And when we confuse a thought or somebody else telling you something to think about as a fact, that's where we get confused in a way
right.
of what is real, what should be true. And so, most of our audience is former believing Mormons. And when former believing Mormons look at the evidence against Joseph Smith, they clearly see to them that Joseph Smith was most likely a fraud, right? Where before he was the prophet and whatever he said came from God, right? But once they're able to be free from those thoughts, where you also look for things to affirm what you believe. Confirmation is what you look for, and that creates a bias.
Right.
So I'm going back to the author of the book about believing thoughts.
Byron Katie, yeah.
How do we realize that those thoughts aren't necessarily the truth?
Well, I've taught this in my classes on sales and things for years, and so I hold up my hand with my 5 fingers, and so the first finger is the occurrence, the event, or the teaching that we read about, or whatever it is, okay, which may or may not be true, but we then form a conclusion about it, because that's what we do as humans. We want to create a conclusion, a finalization to things instead of keeping it open. So we make a conclusion in our mind. And then the middle finger, appropriately, is the emotion, because following the thought comes the emotion. And when the emotion hits, it's powerful and takes over. And that's what I recognize about my own, my own going into such strong activity in the Mormon Church was the emotion. I didn't recognize that pattern, that something would happen, that I would have a thought attached to it, and then the emotion would come and just boom. And then following the emotion is we take an action because of the emotion. So for me, it was to go to a Mormon college. For me, it was to go on a mission. For me, it was to get married in the temple. Those are big steps that I could have avoided had I understood the thought model. And then, of course, the last step is the result. You got the results of your actions. So that's helped me a lot going through the navigating the black ice of Mormonism, and then getting out of it was a hard thing, and I guess for all of us it was a hard thing, because we wanted it. Most of us wanted it to be true so badly, just like with Scott Dale Owen, doctor. I didn't want him to be to have these issues, right? But they were issues he had because before any of this happened, his own cousin, as they were just teenagers, had accused him of abusing him. And his cousin, is just a kid, and the kid's not going to make up stuff like that. But they, of course, believed Elder Owen, Scott, because he just had that way about him. And why would they believe some crazy over here, right? His cousin. But there was always signs, there were always evidences, there were always things that we have a tendency to just quickly want to put it into a certain bin and then set out of the way, right? And so that's one of the faults that we have in our being human and being Mormon. I think we really do that a lot. We hear something, we read something, we have a tendency to want to believe it if it fits within those norms that we're used to. If it fits in those norms, then hey, I'm all in, and I'm going to rationalize everything else to fit around it. And so we're as Mormons or any religion like that, we're just sitting ducks, waiting to be led by somebody, right? And because we think the thought and then the emotion takes hold, and then we take action based on
It
that
reminds me of
emotion.
like a missionary might have an investigator read a scripture and then say, how does that make you feel? And if the people say it makes me feel good, it's like, then the next thing is like, will you be baptized if more things like that happen, or whatever? If I don't know, because I didn't serve a mission actually. So, but I went to missionary training classes, and I remember hearing those things, and I remember hearing other people talk about, even in the first discussion, people people can't do anything unless you ask, right? People aren't going to just spontaneously just do things. And so you ask, will you do this? The other thing now is there's a corollary question we invite you, right, to be baptized or something like that, if all these other things fit. And it's basically like you're saying, it's a numbers game, just like even any sales position. You go through the pitch and you ask for the sale, right? And some people do and some people don't. It doesn't mean your product is true or not. It just means that some people will.
Well, I was just going to say, how often have we watched a very good magician? Let's just take Chris Angel. Walk off the top of a building and float down to the audience, or cut a woman in half, and there's just absolutely no way, as we're watching, there's no way he could fake that. And how often have we said, well, he must have sold his soul to the devil, or there's something evil, because those tricks are real. It's all about illusion. And once we find out how it's really done, it's like, oh. And I think so many of these predators in our society are that type of an illusionist. We think, oh, they're incredible people. So there's just, we're completely deceived by the illusion that they're putting out there, that they're righteous, to the point where even someone who's supposed to be spiritually in tune continues to advance this individual in their callings in the church, and he continues to
right. And the church
in his
sets up people to believe. Is like, people in authority are called of God, and because they're called of God, they have a spirit of discernment, and because they have the spirit of discernment, you can trust them with their advice or with almost anything they say. It's like,
bingo.
They're the ones that are closer to God than you are, and so you should trust them. So they have this built-in trust system that John is talking about. We should examine using our other parts of our brain other than our belief system.
Yeah, well, Gene, when you were talking before about the sales, like missionary work is like sales. In the chapter of my book, chapter 19, called "Missionaries Gone Wild," I go over in about 3 pages. I go over that exact thing, and because I've been in manager in sales for most of my adult life. And so as the manager, I was the one who would teach them and utilize these techniques, I'll call them, techniques to teach to the salespeople to go out and utilize, right? And so this is kind of...
And the benefit of the salesperson and the company supersedes the actual benefits of the customer.
Right. So it's all about the numbers. You got to keep those numbers up. And I used to teach that in the sales. I used to teach that, that it takes so many contacts to finally get an appointment. And then it takes so many appointments to finally get the sale. And so you play those percentages, you play those numbers out, and it gives salespeople something to hold on to firmly and know what's going to work, right? And in missionary program was for me anyway, back in 1978, 79, 80, it was exactly that way. It was.
That's right. And salespeople get a commission check, right? And
right.
Missionaries, the commission check is waiting for them in heaven.
Right.
There's this future payoff that we don't even know exists.
Well,
but
and the immediate payoff is approval. Right. So we get the approval of our mission president. We get the approval of our fellow missionaries. We get the approval. And how much of what we do, there's a chapter in the book called The Approval Payoff. And so how much of what we did in the Mormon Church did we do because we wanted that approval payoff from our parents, from our church leaders, from, whoever. So that was our reward, our immediate reward. And of course, like you just said,
the earthly reward. But how many times did they read the scripture that said, if you save one soul, how great will be your reward in heaven, even if you just save one soul?
Yeah. Well, I think there's an immediate payoff for someone like Scott, and that's his gratification, self-gratification. Right. That's the immediate payoff for him, and he's creating that illusion that he's just a spotless, clean, wonderful individual, and no one can imagine when these other kids came forward and said, "Look, this is what he did." The mission president, who obviously had discernment, would just ignore that because he was baffled. He was convinced, "Oh no, it can't be this. It can't be this missionary. He's my prime elder."
That's right. And partly what I do for Latter Daily Digest is to show people's stories, and it shows that people, when they go through their creative process, they're using their brains and they're coming up with their own thoughts and they're expressing them, right? They're taking a leap of faith in a way that their own thoughts can be meaningful for other people. And so once our audience can see other people thinking for themselves and expressing their things, I'm hoping that empowers our audience to think for themselves and to be able to maybe be creative in their own way at some point in the future. But also here we're talking about how you can use thinking for yourself to defend yourself from people that might take advantage of you. And we see lots of our relatives that are still attending, and we see that there's value that they have from the church. And they might say to someone like me, "Why did you post the bad news of Elder Owen," right? If I had posted that on my wall, and I try to say, well, it's just information, right? The church. I'm trying to help the church be better. That you can't improve yourself until you realize you have a flaw or a lack in your own life, and the church can't improve unless members see that there are things that they need to be safeguarded from, right? And this show in particular, I hope will show people what steps they can take to protect themselves from somebody who's charismatic, who might take advantage of them. And we talked before the show a little bit that it doesn't always lead to abuse. It doesn't always lead to financial manipulation, where somebody takes advantage of you and, borrows, let's say $10,000 or $20,000 and then ghosts you and doesn't show up anymore. And so I only say that because that's some of my lived experience. And so, I trusted people and to be good, right? The people I trusted, I knew had values that they got from the church, and that there's no way that they would ever want to cheat me for my money, because they, they would face repercussions in heaven. Well, maybe they present all these goodness, but then they don't really believe that they will suffer any consequences for doing things like that. And so that's the risk. And we see people in upper leadership in the church, and we, as believing members, we just think the world of them. There's no reason. We see them in nice suits and ties. We see them sitting in big red comfy chairs. They give talks about how good people should be, and we assume they're given those talks because they are that good. They have reached perfection almost, and they're just trying to help us become just as good as they are. But there could be other motivations that they have, right? And so, and I try to tell people lately is like, well, we see these people for maybe 30 minutes every 6 months, and otherwise we don't have any interactions. We don't know if they're nice to their paper boy, or they tip their waitress, generously, or they do actually help people out. We don't know their lives at all. We only see like a facade. And how do we trust what they're doing? And so one way to trust what they're doing would be to see how well they're running the church, right? Okay, how do the finances look in the church? Does the membership look in the church? And we don't know very much of that. The church does not let us see what the finances are. The church doesn't let us see the accurate numbers for membership. They only just say, here are the increases. They don't show how many people are attending, necessarily, and stuff like that. And so getting back to the thought process, when you were saying those 5 things, those things are what we should be aware of. If somebody's trying to say, how does that make you feel? They're not looking out for your interest. They're looking to manipulate you. So how do we guard against that?
Well, that's a question for the ages, but I would say that one of the best things that a customer in a sales situation, or a investigator, or someone who's looking into the church could do, is just to say, let me think about that over the weekend. Okay? And then we're taught sales techniques to try to make a quick decision and not have anybody think about it over the weekend, right? And the same kind of thing. So really, it's just a very common sense thing to do and withstand the pressure. Well, this deal you're going to get here is only going to work if you do it before 5 o'clock today, or before, whatever. And so it's just to try to create urgency in people, right? And so the same thing goes with our own minds. Our own minds are basically just storytellers. So our own minds just are constantly telling stories based on our experiences of the past. And so we need to always live in the question, always ask that question of, um, of or not question, but live in awareness. I'm sorry. We want to live in awareness and be aware of our own thoughts, our own emotions, try to follow in our minds how that emotion is attaching to that thought and how that affects our future decisions. And when we can reach a point of awareness, it is so helpful to get through a lot of the fluff. And the fluff can be so easily deceiving that we want to make sure that no matter who it is, no matter how sure we are, we want to slow it all down. We want to take the weekend or take a couple days and think about it, whether it's in a sales situation or a calling in church or whatever it is. Let me think about it. Let me talk to my spouse about it. Let me get back to it.
Well, and that is why the title of your book is so apropos, because anyone who's lived in the cold country knows that the road looks clear, everything's good, but we've learned to utilize other senses and other data, like, well, it is only 28 degrees out there. And,
Right. The black
even
ice is
though everything looks good,
the
maybe,
unseen danger.
yeah, we don't see it coming until we've lived in the cold country a while and we learn to put up those senses so that
Right. You
we
think about all the data that you could be made aware of. The more data you have,
exactly. Yeah,
like
so
if
that's
it's
why I love the title of the book, because you're cruising along a road and everything looks good. So, you know, as expected, nothing's going to go wrong. But we know about the warning signs of the low temperatures, and oh, by the way, why are there cars pulled off the side of the road everywhere? It's that black ice that we're trying to navigate, and in life, there's so many patches of black ice that come along, like Scott, like this predator who um, has deceived everyone into thinking the road is clear. And
because you can gain confidence in people.
exactly, and then he betrays that, and oh, suddenly they've slid off the road and they're in a ditch, and Scott goes to the next road, and that's why I love the title of the book, because it's these unexpected. We make a turn and suddenly we're sliding around the road because we don't see it coming. It's deceitful, and there's so many people like that. Now, I had a state president who, well, actually, he was first counselor in the state presidency, and he was one of those that was always preaching, like you said, Gene, always preaching, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, we've got to achieve perfection. Well, he's he's in prison now for sexually abusing his grandchildren and visitors that would come over, and no one could ever have seen that coming. They could never have seen that coming. Well, we know a little better now that there are some warning signs, like people who come across as the holier than thou, people who come across as you've got to do this and you've got to do that. It's like, that's one of the red flags that always pops up for me, is why are they so insistent that we become perfect? Um, maybe it's because they're preaching against what their own fallacy is.
Because they're so aware of their imperfections, they project everybody else needs to become perfect.
Yeah, it's like the congressperson who is doing all he can to eliminate gay rights. And of course, he's the one that always ends up being caught.
Closeted.
Yeah, being caught in a restroom with another man and arrested for solicitation. It's just so ironic, and it's a pandemic in the church right now. Not just the Mormon church, but in people with positions of trust, like John was saying. Those are those patches of black ice.
In the UK, the women of 21st Century Saints, Jane Christie and Sarah, can't remember Sarah's last name, they advocated for the church leaders to be made aware that, individual leaders like bishops and branch presidents to be made aware, if they don't do certain things, they will be targeted by the law and be subject to penalties if they don't do certain things. In making these leaders aware, they got chastised by higher leadership and the lawyers of the higher leadership, saying, we know better than you do. And it turns out that, 21st Century Saints were right. And they call it, safeguarding. They're safeguarding laws that if the leaders in a local congregation don't do certain things, they become liable. Like if they don't submit people who are called to have leadership or give other services to minors, they have to have a background check. The church fought against background checks, right? And the church says we have a gold standard for protecting people. And now a law was recently passed in Utah, I believe, mandating background checks. And the church says, thanks to us, we helped get this background check law passed. And it's like, well, you were fighting against it. And one of the arguments was, well, the background check doesn't catch everybody, but it catches some, right? It prevents some people from being placed in positions where they can eventually do some harm to somebody, right? Having information and being made aware of these things only helps everybody to be safer. The fact that the church basically says automatically you should trust your leaders is a warning sign, right? And so how do we help our loved ones that are still in the church realize that they need to have safeguarding things in place? Another question for the ages.
Another question for the ages. I think it's a lot of asking them questions myself, because usually when they answer the questions, they hear themselves and then they're like, oh yeah. So maybe ask them a question. What do you think the followers of Jim Jones in Guyana in 1978 or 9 or whatever, what do you think they were told by Jim Jones and the other leaders? What do you think? So using parallels, asking questions, allowing them to talk it out, maybe is one of the answers. But like you say, it's a question for the ages.
That's right. Even in Heaven's Gate, until they drank the Flavor Aid, until they committed mass suicide, they were just a group of people that were following Jesus to themselves. That's what they were thinking, right? The Jim Jones people, they were trying to create, Eden in South America. And when family members of the people that were in said, hey, my family members not contact me, I think they're in a cult. And then the representative flew down to see for themselves and ended up getting murdered. That's when it hit the fan. And in order to protect the leaders of the Jim Jones People's Temple group, they committed mass suicide at the direction of their leaders. And you never know when that's going to happen. Like we're taught in the church, someday we're all going to be told to go to Missouri, right? And be ready, or someday something else is going to happen, and be ready in case the church asks you to do stuff. There's a covenant made in the temple that someday you might have to consecrate everything you have and give to the church. And so that's like a warning sign right there,
Well, at the risk of sounding jaded, the 2-word mantra that sometimes we have to live by is trust no one. Trust no one until they have completely earned that trust. And what the combination is to earn that trust depends on the circumstances. But like John says, based on the personality of Scott, no one would ever suspect anything because there was no research done because they didn't feel like it needed to be done. He was charismatic like most of the serial killers. They can draw people in, and they can, you can only trust people no matter what you think of them, whether they're your leader or a subordinate. You can only trust them once you've experienced life with them and asked, like John says, ask the proper questions.
That's right.
And
we're talking about physical abuse, but there's also, we had Lila Tuller on talking about spiritual abuse. There are other harms that exist in the world that aren't physical. And so things affect us mentally, things affect us in other ways that we just can't see, we can't perceive them physically, but they do eventually harm us. And so the main thing that I think we're talking about is like the black eye situation. Be aware of other things other than one sense, other than what you see, or other than what you feel, or other than what other people might say to you. Try to gather information, try to collect more data, try to, investigate. Somebody in the church, I think it was Dale Owen, said, that the answer to some tough questions about doubting things in the church is not research. And we're saying that is totally wrong. It is research. You could always get more information, right? And so, if the person that's least likely to tell you the whole truth about something is somebody who's trying to sell you it, right? They're not going to give you all the bad points. They're taught to tell you all the good points. And it's up to you to find out what the bad points might be. And you have to sometimes find those things other places.
John, on a personal level, how did that make you feel when you first found out about your former mission compadre?
Yeah, well, it floored me. I mean, it just shocked me. And I remember exactly where I was when I pulled that up and I saw that, not the sentencing, but the initial when he was first apprehended, and he was making a run for southern Utah, and he was caught around Spanish Fork or whatever, and then he was brought back to Provo, and so he's been incarcerated since. Well, yeah, because I trusted him so much, and I would say I loved him as a brother. I just loved him. He was my sanity. He made me laugh all the time on the mission during some very difficult times. So when I read that, I was just floored. And like we're just talking about, like Gene's talking about, like you were talking about, I had to go back in my mind and think back through what were the events of my mission that would have told me something. What are the events that maybe I just showed my naivete, but he was like Liam Neeson. He was breaking from norms people would trust because of the norms of the Mormon Church and what we're used to and what our senses will believe and all those kind of things. And man, like Jimmy Jones, of Guyana, it was just a bad, a bad situation of misplaced trust.
It kind of makes you go back, and I mean, hindsight's 2020, right? But when you see the story, that's when you start thinking back about all the things that were said.
But that's the thing that's why we study history, is so that we don't make the same mistakes, right? So if we can go back and see what things were warning signs, then when you can write a book and you can tell people, here are some of the warning signs, right? And so that is the most important thing. So, the whole thing about a con man is confidence, right? And so you have just as confidence in a con man as you do in the nicest neighbor that'll bend over backwards for you, right? And that it's indistinguishable until the con hits, till you finally do get damage from it. But there are ways, and we need to work on finding those ways there. I was thinking about the signs of the times, right? And the signs of the times now are to look around us and be made aware of what things are out there. So thanks, John and Randy, for coming on the show. I will provide a link to one of the news articles, and from there people can, do more research on it. And it's a salacious thing. It's something that, can help bring attention to how to watch around themselves, how to take precautions and things to do. And so I favor background checks for leadership positions, where sensitive people might be underneath those leaders. And so yeah, thanks, John, for writing your book. And we'll also have a link to the book. What were you going to say, Randy?
I was just going to say two things, John. I'd just be curious, in your words, what you have learned from navigating on black ice, and if there's a second book in the works.
Well, to answer your last question, I don't have a second book in the works that specifically are about Mormonism and about that faith crisis type situation. But the first question, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. What was the first question you asked?
What was it? I mean, what can you take away from your experience? What did you learn from the discovery of Scott and in retrospect, what were the lessons that you took away from that anyone listening can glean, maybe some precaution on their part?
Yeah, I would just say awareness, that I need to always be aware and be willing to step back from it and ask questions about it and follow that thought model, and not get caught up in the emotion of, wow, this person's so charismatic and wants to be my friend and da, 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 and just, that kind of thing. Take the step back, take the time to think about it. And when little clues come in,
Don't brush them aside.
don't brush them aside. Look
That is
into it.
part of the data. That's part of
No
the
matter
data.
what their position is, no matter what their calling is.
Right.
Almost the more charismatic somebody is, the more careful you should be. Just like the wolf in sheep's clothing.
Right.
Don't just think about how they look. Think about, get more data. How sharp are their teeth at some point? How much damage can they do to you if you give them your trust? So yes, everyone like and subscribe, do the things. It's 2025. Have a great rest of the year. And we need to be consciously and constantly vigilant and be aware of all the things around us. And if anybody has a desire to be on our show, if you've written a book, if you have a podcast, we'd be happy to interview you. So thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
guys.